Welcome to The Right Atmosphere, a podcast for writers brought to you by Atmosphere Press, the only publisher that puts rewarding and meaningful author experiences above all else. I'm your host, Kayla. On this episode, we're going to be tackling the question, what are common misconceptions about hybrid publishing? And we'll be doing that with our special guest, Trista Edwards. Trista holds a PhD in creative writing from the University of North Texas, as well as an MA and BA from the University of West Georgia. She's the author of Spectral Evidence from April Gloaming Press in 2020 and the editor of Till the Tide, an anthology of mermaid poetry from Sundress Publications in 2015. Her poems have appeared in Ligeia Magazine, Flapper House, Dream Pop Press, Southeast Review, The Adroit Journal, White Stag, Lover's Eye Press, and more. And when she's not talking about books, you can find Trista working on her various miniature dollhouses or making candles. Thank you so much for joining me, Trista.
Yeah, it's great to be here, Hayla. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, of course. I'm especially excited to have you because since you work as Atmosphere Press's acquisitions manager, I know that your work is very deeply entrenched in the nuances of hybrid publishing. So I feel like you're the perfect person to dispel myths that you're encountering all the time about hybrid publishing. So I'm excited to ask you to speak on some common misconceptions about hybrid publishing that you encounter.
I talk with authors a lot, people who are very interested in publishing with us. And from my experience, when I'm having these phone calls, these meetings with authors, to go over their book and just any questions they have about publishing, I tend to find that there are two main camps of people who really understand and know what hybrid publishing is, and people who are just learning about it for the first time. And they're kind of on a fact-finding mission to understand kind of the intricacies of hybrid publishing. And I think there's a lot of misconceptions about hybrid publishing, and I think that comes down to people, um, from my experience, seem to have kind of one idea of publishing in their mind, which is traditional publishing, which has kind of had the monopoly on publishing and our collective understanding of what publishing is for forever.
Yeah,
Um,
right.
I like to break down to people who are learning about hybrid publishing for the first time that, there are several different paths to publishing. It's not just traditional. And one of them, there's self-publishing, hybrid publishing, and traditional. And I always say one is not better than the other. It's all, what are you looking for? What's the best for you and your book? What kinds of goals and desires do you have? Um, One of the, naturally, of course, when I'm talking with authors, there is investment, there is financial investment involved with hybrid publishing. And I think that's really um, typically what throws people off when they're learning about it for the first time. They have that idea of traditional publishing in their head where, a press or an agent says, "We love your book, we love your story, we're going to publish it, you're going to be in bookstores everywhere." And that can happen, and that's great. But it's a little bit different with hybrid publishing, where you're investing up front, and you're working with a professional team of editors and publicists and designers, and you have much more creative control over the process. You have a quicker timeline, from the time that you get to hold that book in your hands. You have kind of control over the cover design, which are typically things that you don't have control over in traditional publishing. Um, but of course, with traditional publishing, you're not investing up front. Um, so a lot of people have this misconception that, um, to pay for your own work, to pay for publishing, somehow devalues it. And I completely disagree. Um, I come from an academic background, and, you know, I have spent a lot of my own, I've spent a lot of finances on my own work. Whether that comes to um, paying submission fees when I send out poems, whether that comes to classes that I take to learn more about my craft and kind of create community. Um, Paying editors when I need help with copy editing, because copy editing is not an area I'm good at. I spend money on, maybe going to conferences and the travel fees involved with that, all to kind of build my community and promote my work and to make my work better because I believe in it and I believe it has value. So I'm willing to kind of put my own time and money into my work. I think that's the truth with, hybrid publishing. You believe in your work and you know that it's good, and you need help improving it, and you need the help of a professional team to edit, to make the cover, to do the actual production part. And so I think, that doesn't devalue it if you are putting that money into it up front. Um, we're all putting money into as writers, we're all putting money into our writing, I think in different ways. Um, so I had an interesting conversation with a musician who was wanting to do a memoir of his life as a musician, touring, his music, being in a band. And he had not heard of hybrid publishing before. And I had a really interesting conversation with him, and we kind of brought up that he got the impression that the publishing world can be a little bit precious about putting money into work. Whereas with other art forms, say music, particularly maybe, or even like filmmaking, we really seem to champion people who kind of buck the system.
Mm.
They kind of DIY it, very like punk rock style, like I'm not going with the label. I'm doing it my own way. I don't need someone to tell me if I'm good. I don't need someone to give me a yes. I'm going to give me the yes. And that conversation with him was very enlightening with his background as a musician, because he's like, when I explained to him, the financial investment involved with hybrid publishing, he's like, oh, I totally get it. And he's like, I wouldn't go to a studio and ask for, recording time or practice time with not thinking that I didn't have to pay for the studio space. And he's like, and that in no way feels like it devalues my music, that I'm investing in what I need to make it better. And it really got me thinking about how we view other art forms, and how we make art in other ways, when it comes to having to invest money in it, that it, again, somehow devalues it. But, we really champion Kickstarter projects, when it comes to maybe filmmaking and crowdfunding. Um, so yeah, it just really got me thinking from, that conversation with him, that there is something about publishing. I don't know how this myth began, that, to kind of invest in yourself in that way and to pay for your book, to pay to work with a team somehow demeans it.
Right. And I love that comparison that you were getting from this musician because I think that really highlights how collaborative hybrid publishing can be. It's not, there's a little bit less of that kind of power imbalance where, with a traditional publisher, often they are just they're calling the shots and you kind of have to go along with it. And whereas in a model like hybrid publishing, because you're paying for the services of an editor and a designer and all of those people, you're getting a lot of really valuable input, but ultimately you've got that final say.
Hmm.
And with that being said, I also really liked what you mentioned at the beginning about the models of traditional self-publishing and hybrid in the middle. They're different. They're not tiered necessarily. I think that's so important as well. For each different author is going to get something different from each model. And what works for one author obviously doesn't necessarily work for the next. So I love that approach of, figuring out what works for you and your desires and your writing. Before we say goodbye to our guest, I'm happy to say that this episode is brought to you by Atmosphere Press, the only publisher that puts rewarding and meaningful author experiences above all else. Founded in 2015 by an author and PhD in literature and devoted to serving authors through editorial, design, publication, and promotion, Atmosphere has sold tens of thousands of copies of their authors' books across 6 continents. Visit atmospherepress.com to sign up for Atmosphere's newsletter, The Launchpad, and to learn about submission opportunities, event news, and free book, publicity, and writing residency giveaways. So, thank you so much for coming on, Trista. This was so great to learn about these kind of misconceptions and different perspectives on them. I just want to ask before we finish today, where should our listeners go if they want to learn more about you and your writing and what you do?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, if you want to learn more about my writing, I have a website. You can go to tristaedwards.com. And then you can always find me on Instagram. So, we can connect there at Trista Marie Edwards.com, or not .com, at Trista Marie Edwards on Instagram.
Fantastic. Well, thank you again so much, Trista. Thanks to
Thank
all the
you.
listeners for tuning in, and have a great rest of your day.
Thanks. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for joining us on this episode of The Right Atmosphere, the Advice for Writers podcast. If you liked what you heard, please leave a review and share this podcast with the writers in your life. And if you're ready to take the next step in your publication journey, visit atmospherepress.com to submit your manuscript for publication consideration or to learn more about writing and what it is that we do. I'm Hala. Thanks for listening, and I'll catch you in the next episode.